Skyrim's story begins long before its mountains rose from the earth, long before mortals breathed, or kingdoms formed, or dragons learned to write their names across the sky. In the oldest memories of the Elder Scrolls universe, time itself was still soft, shaping and reshaping creation in currents that moved like dreams. There was no Skyrim, no Tamriel, no North, no South, only the roiling possibility of a world that had not yet decided whether it wished to be born. The spirits who would one day become gods were still figuring out what existence meant, drifting like thoughts in the mind of a sleeping giant. Among these spirits were two forces whose destinies would forever shape Skyrim's fate: Akatosh, the dragon god of time, and Lorkhan, the wandering trickster whose ideas were always half creation, half chaos. Together, they and countless other Edada would eventually cause the spark that formed the world, but in the beginning there was only contemplation and the faint awareness that something greater might someday rise from the void. As the universe began to take shape, the spirits debated whether a mortal plane should exist at all. Akatosh and his kin were hesitant, knowing that creating a physical world meant binding themselves in ways they could not undo. Lorkhan, however, was enthralled by the idea of a place where new life could test itself, where struggle might give meaning to existence. The tension between these opposing visions slowly churned into the first great cosmic conflict, one that would echo over thousands of years and shape the destinies of every creature who would one day walk on Nirn's land. Out of these disagreements, creation took shape more like a compromise than a triumph. The world was formed, but at great cost, and the spirits who participated found themselves weakened, drained, or forever changed. Skyrim's mountains were carved from that sacrifice, its rivers trickling through wounds left in the fabric of reality, and its sky stretching open over a world born from disagreement rather than harmony. As time solidified into something measurable, Akatosh's influence began to anchor the new plane, giving structure to moments and memories and futures that could finally be counted instead of imagined. The earliest days of Nirn were harsh and shifting, the land unstable, the seas restless, and the sky flickering with unpredictable bursts of magic. Skyrim did not yet resemble the cold, jagged tundra it would later become. Instead, it was part of a raw and violent landscape where elemental forces clashed constantly. Massive storms tore across the north, carving deep valleys and lifting mountains into the air before dropping them again. The ancestors of dragons watched these storms from the clouds, feeling the world settle beneath them like a great beast tired from birth. Dragons were among the first stable forms of life to inhabit this new world, each one an extension of time itself, a living piece of Akatosh's essence. They did not yet rule Skyrim, but they existed above it, eternal and patient, waiting for creation to settle enough for something like civilization to make sense. As ages passed, the world slowly stabilized. Oceans cooled, continents found their resting shapes. The forces that once ripped the earth apart began to fade into quieter patterns of weather and seasons. Skyrim grew colder as its latitude shifted, the climate settling into one ruled by winter's long reach. Snow began to blanket the mountains year-round, forming the frozen peaks that would one day shelter cities and fortresses. During this time, the ancient spirit children, known as the El-Nofe, wandered the world. Some remained closely tied to the original spirits and would become the ancestors of Myr, while others adapted to the physical world more deeply and would eventually give rise to humans. In these early ages, Skyrim held no cities, no tribes, no clans, only these wandering ancestors crossing frostbitten plains, their memories filled with the echo of creation's sacrifices. One of the first great tragedies that shaped Skyrim's destiny occurred long before men set foot in the province. A great war broke out between the El-Nofe, dividing them into Old El-Nofe and Wandering El-Nofe. Their conflict tore the world apart once again, reshaping continents and altering landscapes with devastating magical force. Though the war was not fought specifically for Skyrim, the North bore its scars more deeply than other regions. Mountain ranges cracked open, ancient glaciers split apart, and valleys flooded with seas that had no names yet. Out of the ruin came a more defined shape for what would become Skyrim, its borders carved not by diplomacy or culture, but by the raw violence of a mythic conflict far beyond mortal understanding. The land settled into a form familiar to future generations, a land of frost, stone, and deep ancient wounds. As the Merethic era dawned, Mer-like peoples, known as the Aldmer, began to spread across Tamriel, shaping cultures and building the earliest settlements. Skyrim, however, remained largely untouched by their influence. The climate was harsher than the milder southern provinces, and the rugged terrain made travel difficult. Only a few adventurous or exiled groups of Mer ventured into the northern reaches, leaving behind ruins that would later be mistaken for the works of later civilizations. Skyrim's earliest history remained one of silence, ice, and wind until a new people emerged from across the sea, the Atmorans. The ancestors of humanity, the Atmorans, arrived in Skyrim in waves that stretched across centuries. They came from the frozen land of Atmora, a continent gripped by worsening climate and internal conflict. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new era, one where the future of Skyrim would be shaped not by cosmic beings or wandering Mer, but by humans seeking a new home. Early Atmoran settlements were modest, simple hall houses, crude fortifications, encampments along the coasts and river valleys. But their presence introduced something new to Skyrim, a mortal culture forged in harsh, cold, resilient, and fierce enough to survive in a land where even nature seemed to reject life. Among these early Atmorans was Ysgramor, a figure whose legacy looms over Skyrim's history like a shadow that never fades. He arrived in the north with his kin, writing the first crude forms of human script and marking the earliest recorded events in Skyrim's chronology. These humans lived alongside the Snow Elves, a Marish people who had inhabited the region for ages. For a time, there was peace, or at least uneasy coexistence. But as human settlements grew, tensions rose, leading to one of the most defining events in Skyrim's prehistory, the Night of Tears. The Snow Elves, fearing human expansion, launched a devastating attack on the settlement of Sarthal, slaughtering nearly everyone except Ysgramor and his two sons. This tragedy ignited a sequence of events that would forever alter Skyrim's story. Ysgramor returned to Atmora, gathering the legendary 500 companions. With them, he sailed back to Skyrim, seeking vengeance and reclaiming the land with overwhelming force. The Snow Elves, unprepared for such a united assault, were driven into hiding, and many fled into the dark refuge offered by the Dwemer. Tragically, this refuge would become a curse, as the Dwemer's food and experiments gradually twisted the Snow Elves into the blind Falmer, a race condemned to skulk in Skyrim's underground halls for all time. Skyrim's surface now belonged almost entirely to humanity, and Ysgramor's companions etched the earliest human kingdoms onto the land, building fortresses and carving their sagas into stone. This period marked the rise of the dragon cult, a powerful theocratic system that revered dragons not as beasts but as divine rulers. Dragons, timeless and potent, accepted this worship, guiding their priests with a blend of fear and awe. Great temples rose across Skyrim, their stone walls etched with draconic script, their halls echoing with chants that celebrated the eternal authority of the dove. The dragon cult ruled with absolute power, its influence stretching from ancient burial mounds to mountaintop sanctuaries. For centuries, the people of Skyrim lived under the shadow of dragonkind, their lives shaped by offerings, obedience, and awe. But power always breeds rebellion. Over time, the cruelty of the dragon priests became unbearable, and the people rose in defiance. This rebellion gave birth to one of Skyrim's greatest legends, the Dragon War. Mortals learned the Thu'um, the voice of the dragons, with the help of Paarthurnax and the Greybeards atop High Hrothgar. The war raged across the skies and mountains of Skyrim, reshaping the land once again with fire and battle. The ancient barrows and ruins scattered across the province are scars from this conflict, reminders of a time when the sky burned and the mountains shook beneath the wings of immortal destroyers. When Alduin, the World Eater, was banished through time by the Elder Scroll, the war ended and dragons faded into myth, leaving their temples to crumble into lonely monuments. As the First Era began, Skyrim emerged as one of the first unified human kingdoms in Tamriel, ruled by the successors of Ysgramor and guided by the traditions of the ancient Atmaran people. The land gradually shifted from mythic struggle into recorded history, but the echoes of its earliest ages never faded. Skyrim's culture maintained the memory of dragons, the scars of ancient wars, and the deep reverence for ancestors whose courage carved life out of a frozen, unyielding world. The people who called this land home became known as Nords, a proud and resilient folk shaped by the unforgiving beauty of their homeland. Their identity formed slowly, built from the mingling of myth and memory, frost and fire, faith and defiance. From the moment the Dawn Era gave way to form and consequence, the world of Skyrim began drifting toward shape, settling slowly into a land where mountains found their place and the seas pushed softly against the edges of a still awakening continent. As the Aedra weakened from the labor of creation, Nirn became a world defined not by stability but by memory, an echo of a divine struggle that never fully faded. Mortal life emerged gradually in this softened glow, forming around the fractures left behind by ancient beings who were themselves exhausted fragments of something far greater. Skyrim, cold and jagged even then, felt like the leftover breath of a dream too stubborn to die. It was in these earliest moments that the El-Nofi, those ancestral figures who shaped the land through thought and will, settled into the soil of Tamriel, determined to give their descendants a world with structure, even if that structure came from hardship. They felt the pull of the north more strongly than anywhere else, drawn toward the mountains that seemed to rise not from stone but from determination. These first architects of the land shaped Skyrim with sharp edges and unforgiving winters, as if reminding every living being who would one day walk its frozen tundras that nothing worth having would ever come easily. In the ages before men walked the world, the great dragon gods soared across the skies, with Alduin and Paarthurnax among the eldest and most powerful. Time itself seemed to bow around their wings, bending gently as they passed overhead like ripples shifting under a stone. Alduin, the World Eater, carried the weight of destiny in his roar, a role he neither asked for nor questioned. The people who would come later would call him tyrant, destroyer, terror, but in these first ages, he was simply fulfilling the purpose written into him before the world had bones. Dragons were not rulers then, at least not in the mortal sense. They were reflections of the natural order, immense and inevitable, like winter or the passage of seasons. Skyrim's cliffs still echoed with their rumbling voices, and the air shimmered faintly with unspoken words of power. Paarthurnax, beneath the shadow of his brother's inevitability, carried his own burden, a growing curiosity about the fledgling world, a sense that purpose was not a chain but a pathway. As time stretched into the Merethic era, Myr spread across Tamriel like sunlight moving across morning snow. The Aldmer were the first to shape the land in ways that mirrored their ancient memories of the dawn, building crystalline towers and gentle settlements along the warmer coasts. But Skyrim itself called to a more rugged people who felt kinship with its starkness. The early Myr who settled there became the ancestors of the Dwemer and Falmer, two peoples who would one day define the cold north through conflict, innovation, and tragedy. The Dwemer were drawn to the mountains not for their beauty, but for the secrets buried beneath them. They heard the quiet hum of the earth, the subtle rumble of mechanisms that had not yet been built, as if the world whispered engineering into their ears. Deep beneath the future throat of the world, they carved networks of tunnels, chambers, and halls, believing that knowledge was the highest form of worship. Their earliest ruins were lit by soft glowing stones, their walls engraved with angular designs that seemed almost like equations written in metal. They were a people convinced that logic could overcome even the gods, a conviction that would shape their entire destiny. The Falmer, by contrast, loved the sky. They built their earliest homes along windswept ridges, crafting delicate structures that clung to the mountainsides like frost. They worshipped the blue light of winter's sun and believed that every snowflake was a message from a different spirit. Their dances were said to mimic the movements of northern auroras, swaying gently beneath the swirling lights as if conducting conversations with the sky itself. Though they would one day fall into darkness, in these early ages, the Falmer were a people of grace, artistry, and profound connection to the natural world. They carved shrines along cliff edges where the wind never ceased, believing that wisdom lived wherever the cold bit hardest. While Myr shaped Skyrim's earliest cities, the stars themselves began whispering of a great arrival. The constellation of the warrior brightened. The sign of the mouth formed patterns no one had seen in millennia. These celestial murmurs heralded the coming of men, those distant wanderers who had fled at Mora's dying cold. The North remembered them even before their ships arrived, as though the land itself recognized kin sculpted from the same frost. Atmora was a continent fading into myth, its forests freezing, its rivers slowing, its winds carrying the sound of a world quietly surrendering to time. The Nedic peoples who fled its collapse sailed south toward Tamriel, guided by half-remembered stories of a warmer land whispered by ancestors long dead. Their boats creaked like sighs across the sea of ghosts, carrying families, warriors, healers, singers, and children, all bound by the same desperate hope that the world could offer them a future. When these early men first stepped onto Skyrim's shores, the land did not welcome them gently. Its winds cut through their furs, and its mountains towered like silent judges. But men, hardened by Atmora's long winter, felt at home in the struggle. They lit fires that glowed like defiance against the snow. Their tents clustered near frozen coastlines, glowing warm in the blue shadows of pine forests. They hunted, explored, learned, and gradually began carving their presence into the landscape. It was said that the first time a human's boot touched Skyrim's soil, the ground trembled not in fear, but in recognition. For the first time since the Elnofi shaped the world, a people had arrived who felt truly at home in the cold. These first settlers would one day become the Nords, but in these early days, they were simply wanderers trying to understand a land that demanded strength. They listened to the wind, studied the movements of auroras, and followed the paths of ancient animals whose instincts had mapped Skyrim long before maps existed. And as men spread across the frozen valleys, the dragons took notice. At first, they watched from distant peaks, studying these small, determined beings. Some dragons found them amusing, others found them intriguing. Parthernax, the most curious of them all, believed that men possessed something rare, a spark that could grow into something powerful. Alduin, ever bound to the duty of renewal through destruction, watched for different reasons. He did not hate men, he simply saw them as part of the cycle he was destined to govern. When finally the dragons revealed themselves to men, the sky darkened with wings large enough to dim the sun. The first words spoken between the two races echoed through the bones of the world itself. In that moment, men were given the chance to fear or to kneel, and many chose the latter. Some clans worshipped the dragons as gods, believing their fire to be the breath of creation itself. Others resisted quietly, unsure whether these mighty beings were divine protectors or tyrants biding their time. For a while, there was peace, a tense, uneasy coexistence between those who walked and those who soared. Then came the dragon cult. It began slowly, like frost building on a window pane, spreading its influence through awe, reverence, and fear. Priests adorned in scaled robes preached the divinity of Alduin, claiming that he alone had the right to rule over every living soul. Their voices grew louder each season, and soon entire villages knelt to dragons who demanded worship rather than respect. The dragon cult's temples rose across Skyrim's mountains, carved into cliffsides and canyon walls with a precision that seemed impossible for mortal hands. Their altars burned with blue flame, fueled by oils so ancient they seemed drawn from the blood of the earth, but not everyone bowed. Among humans were those who sensed danger in Alduin's growing influence. They believed that worship should never be forced, that respect must be earned, not commanded. These early rebels hid in caves, forged alliances in whispered meetings, and studied the movements of dragons the same way one might study the storms of the north, knowing that weather could be endured, but tyranny could not. Their defiance was quiet at first, but defiance rarely stays quiet forever. It was Paarthurnax who would eventually shift the world's course. He, unlike his brother, saw potential in these mortals, a potential that might one day rival even the voice of dragons. He questioned the nature of authority, the meaning of destiny, and the right of one being to stand above all others. In a moment that would ripple through all eras to come, he did the unthinkable. He taught men the way of the voice. The first humans to learn the Thu'um felt power bloom in their throats, like sparks igniting from dry tinder. Words became more than sound. They became force, intent, will. This gift, this dangerous, beautiful power, gave men the ability to stand against Alduin's rule. The dragon war that followed reshaped Skyrim's history forever. Mountains cracked under the force of shouted winds. Valleys burned with dragon fire bright enough to turn midnight into dawn. The sky itself seemed torn between two destinies, one of domination and one of freedom. Though men fought bravely, it was only when the Elder Scroll entered the story that the battles began to shift. A group of desperate warriors used it to cast Alduin into the currents of time, not knowing where he would land or what consequences would follow. In that moment, Skyrim exhaled a breath of victory that would echo across future generations. With Alduin gone and many dragons slain or in hiding, the dragon cult crumbled. Temples fell silent. Shrines froze over, and men began to shape Skyrim not as servants, but as rulers. The centuries after the Dragon War became the foundation for everything Skyrim would one day become, but that story drifts gently into the next part. Long before the modern Nordic kingdoms ever took shape, Skyrim belonged to a very different kind of order, one shaped by reverence, fear, and an understanding of power that existed long before temples, cities, or kingdoms were even possible. As the early humans settled across northern Tamriel, still recovering from the violent exodus that had driven them out of Atmora, they found themselves under the open sky of a cold, ancient land that was already steeped in quiet myth and cosmic memory. Snow drifted across untouched valleys, rivers cut their slow lines through stone, and the mountains watched everything with an indifferent calm. It was into this harsh, beautiful silence that the dragons descended, and with them came the first true hierarchy Skyrim would ever know. To the early humans, the dragons were not creatures of flesh alone. They were living symbols of time, destiny, and cosmic law. Their voices shaped the world, their presence bent nature itself, and their flight patterns carved paths across the sky like writing that mortals could only hope to interpret. The humans did not resist them at first. Instead, they bowed, instinctively recognizing the immense force that could shatter mountains and silence storms. Yet it was not all dragons who enforced their rule, only those who chose to wield their voices as weapons rather than as harmonious expressions of the world's rhythm. And above them all was Alduin, the World Eater, believed by many to be the very herald of time's ending. As the dragons took their place above mortal life, mortals themselves began to build structures to honor them. These were not the carved stone temples seen in later eras, but primitive shrines of wood, bone, and carved river stone placed at the mouths of caves or atop high cliffs. Each shrine served as a symbol of allegiance, a declaration that humans were willing to stand under the wing of beings far greater than themselves. Over generations, these shrines became more refined, evolving into towering monuments etched with symbols that would one day become recognizable as the early forms of the dragon alphabet. Priests rose from within human ranks, chosen for their strong voices, keen memory, and unwavering devotion. These priests served as intermediaries between the dragons and their followers, speaking for the people and commanding the worship that dragons felt was their natural due. In exchange, these priests gained knowledge, the first whispers of dragon tongue, the principles of ordering society, and the harsh truths of power used without mercy or compassion. Through these priests, the earliest form of the dragon cult emerged an organized belief system that stretched across all of Skyrim. Every valley, every river, and every settlement fell under the influence of this growing institution. People gathered in structured rituals, chanting praises to specific dragons, offering tribute, and following strict laws designed to maintain order. With every passing season, the cult grew more formidable, adopting a rigid hierarchy that mirrored the dragons themselves. At the highest level were the dragon priests, men and women who had surrendered their humanity willingly, allowing their entire lives to become tools of service. Beneath them were the acolytes, who kept the temples, organized gatherings, and interpreted signs from the dragons or their priests. At the lowest level were the common worshippers, people who labored in fields and forges, yet devoted significant portions of their days to honoring the beings they saw as divine protectors and rulers. The temples of the dragon cult grew in complexity as their power solidified. Stonecutters and artisans, blessed or threatened into cooperation, shaped enormous monuments into the mountainsides. Tombs were carved deep into rock, featuring winding corridors lined with carved murals depicting the dragons as creators, guardians, and destroyers. These temples became centers not only of worship, but also of law, governance, and education, enforcing the cult's power and ensuring its continuity. Over time, these temples would become the barrows and ruins explored thousands of years later, still echoing faintly with the aura of ancient rituals and slumbering guardians. It is said that during these centuries, humans lived lives shaped entirely by their faith in the dragons, but also by their fear. Taxes were collected in the form of food, labor, and even lives, offered as tribute to ensure continued protection. Some dragons accepted tribute peacefully, while others demanded it with the threat of fire. This uneven system led to the emergence of resistance in certain corners of Skyrim, a subtle, quiet resentment that would grow more pronounced with each harsh winter and each appearance of a dragon demanding more than the people could give. In remote settlements, whispers began to circulate that the dragons were not gods, but tyrants, exploiting humanity rather than guiding it. But the cult had eyes and ears everywhere, and rebellion rarely survived long before being extinguished. During this time, the dragon priests grew more powerful, gaining abilities that blurred the line between mortal and something other. Through rituals, they extended their lives far beyond normal human spans. Through elixirs and ancient drafts, they sharpened their senses and deepened their connection to their draconic masters. Some wore masks imbued with dragon-forged magic, granting them authority beyond fear, and these masks would one day become priceless relics, each carrying whispers of voices long gone. The priests ruled with the same authority as the dragons themselves, and in certain regions were feared even more. Unlike the dragons, who soared above the world, the priests walked among the people, enforcing the laws of fire and voice with human precision. Yet for all their power, the dragon priests were still human at their core, and among them rose strains of ambition and jealousy. Some sought greater favor, others sought independence, and still others desired that their dragons bow to them instead of the other way around. Even the dragons were not unified in purpose, as some disagreed with Alduin's rulership and wished to guide humans rather than dominate them. These divisions created cracks in a system that had once seemed unbreakable. As seasons turned and centuries passed, these fractures widened, creating opportunities for dissent that had never existed before. It was during this time that the first whispers of the tongues emerged among humanity. Some individuals, warriors, hunters, and mystics began to sense the resonance of draconic power in the world around them. They listened to the wind and heard faint echoes of forgotten syllables. They mimicked the dragon's roaring speech, stumbling through its harsh consonants, yet feeling the power ripple beneath their throats. These early tongues could not shout with the strength that dragons possessed, but they held the potential to grow, and that potential frightened the cult more than any sword ever could. A human who learned even a fragment of the dragon's voice posed a threat to a system built entirely on the idea that mortals must always remain silent. In secret, these early tongues practiced experimenting with breath, posture, and intention. They discovered that dragon tongue is not spoken the way normal words are spoken. It is felt, drawn from deep within the chest, shaped by will rather than thought. They learned that tone and intent meant as much as the syllables themselves. They learned that the voice could push, or pull, or resonate, and though their earliest attempts only produced short bursts of air or faint ripples across the surface of water, the mere existence of these experiments signaled the beginning of a slow shift in Skyrim's balance of power. The dragons sensed this shift long before their human priests ever did. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps the cosmic flow of time warned them, but they knew that something in the world was beginning to change. Some dragons reacted by tightening their control, making harsher demands, burning villages that refused to comply, or insisting upon greater tribute from regions that had previously lived in relative peace. Others reacted with fear, withdrawing to high mountains or deep caverns, choosing silence over conflict, and a small number responded with curiosity, seeking out humans who could speak even a single word of the dragon tongue. They listened to these fragile voices with fascination, perhaps even pride, recognizing echoes of themselves in the tiny sounds that emerged from the throats of mortals. But the cult, unlike the dragons, saw only danger. The emergence of the tongues was evidence that their dominion was slipping, that the bond between humans and dragons was no longer absolute. Priests ordered hunts for those suspected of practicing the voice. Entire families were interrogated. Villages were punished for harboring individuals with unusual abilities. These punishments only fueled resentment, spreading the idea that the dragon cult was no longer a divine institution but a tyranny of fear. And so, slowly, quietly, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. Humans who had once bowed their heads began lifting them. Those who had obeyed out of reverence now obeyed only out of fear, and fear is never a lasting foundation. In isolated corners of Skyrim, deep forests, hidden valleys, secret caves, small groups met in silence, sharing stories of resistance and survival. The tongues trained in these hidden places, refining their voices, strengthening their lungs, and preparing for a conflict they did not yet fully understand. The world was changing. The sky was changing. A storm was forming that would reshape Skyrim forever. And in the heart of that storm stood not dragons, not priests, but humans fragile, determined, and beginning to realize that time itself might be willing to stand with them. Long after the first human kingdoms took shape along the cold shoreline of ancient Skyrim, the world entered an age shaped as much by myth as by memory, a time when the threads of everyday life intertwined with the lingering presence of gods and spirits. The newly settled Nords, still finding their footing after centuries of wandering, began to push inland, carving paths through tundra and forest until their settlements clustered like small lights scattered beneath enormous skies. And yet, even as they built homes, farmed frozen soil, and watched the auroras dance above their thatched roofs, they lived in the shadow of powers older than their language. Dragons still soared across the horizon then, ruling the world from above with the casual certainty of beings who believed their dominion was eternal. Their presence was not simply physical but spiritual, for the Nords believed dragons to be children of the sky itself, woven into the fabric of creation. And so when dragons descended upon early cities, it was not viewed as invasion, but inevitability, a natural imbalance where the mighty reclaimed what was always theirs. It was around this time that great cities began to rise, shaped from stone pulled out of ancient mountains. Nords forged temples atop cliffs, built walls with crude, powerful strokes, and carved runes into stone to honor their ancestors. But beneath all that effort lived a tension that grew with each generation, a question whispered around fires yet never spoken too loudly. What place did humans truly hold in a world ruled by beings born of the sky? Dragons demanded worship, and for a while, that obedience was given freely. High priests and dragon cultists emerged among the Nords, claiming to understand the language of the beasts and to speak with their authority. Massive stone mounds were built to honor the dragons, some acting as shrines, others as tombs for noble cult leaders who claimed to have served faithfully. These early dragon mounds still dot Skyrim's wilderness centuries later, their entrances half buried in snow, their chambers still resonating with echoes of ancient devotion. But beneath growing reverence smoldered a quiet resentment. The Nords, new to these lands yet proud beyond measure, could not bear forever the weight of being lesser. When dragons demanded sacrifices, fear curdled into anger. When priests demanded worship, frustration twisted into rebellion. And in this simmering unrest lay the seed of one of the most defining conflicts in Skyrim's history. The dragon cult, emboldened by their divine patrons, tightened their grip, erecting vast temples across mountains and forests, demanding absolute obedience. Cities were reshaped into fortresses dedicated to dragons. People who questioned the cult faced exile or death. This was not simply a crisis of faith, but a strangling of freedom, and the people who had once bowed their heads now clenched their fists. It was during this age that Kine, the sacred breath giver of the Nords, intervened in a way that shifted the world's fate. Legends speak quietly of how she taught the ancient tongues to harness the dragon's own gift, the voice. No longer confined to dragon throats alone, the Thuum became a weapon wielded by humans. For the first time, resistance had a language of power. Warriors who had once prayed for protection now stood before dragons with shouts that split the air. Fire met fire, wind met wind, and in the space between those clashing roars, a new future began to take shape. The rebellion was not an instant victory. Many battles were lost, cities burned, and entire bloodlines ended under dragon wings. But the spark lit by the voice refused to die, and with each passing generation, the Nords learned new words of power, the way a musician might discover forgotten notes. The climax of this conflict came in a moment that would reshape time itself. Alduin, the World Eater, greatest among dragons and herald of the world's destruction, rose to crush the human resistance. His mere presence filled the sky with a terror that stilled hearts and shook mountains. The tongues, desperate and unwilling to surrender the world to fire, used a forbidden shout that ripped Alduin forward in time. The world was spared, but the consequences echoed across centuries. In those days that followed, the remaining dragons were defeated, hunted, or scattered. The great dragon temples, once filled with chanting cultists, fell silent, their torches extinguished. The rebellion had succeeded, but victory came at the cost of ancient knowledge, broken alliances, and secrets buried deeper than any tomb. When the smoke cleared, the survivors shaped a new age from the ashes of fire and frost. The ancient Nords established the first true centralized kingdom, called the First Nordic Empire. Under the leadership of mighty warrior kings such as Harald, fearless in battle, the people of Skyrim expanded beyond their homeland's mountains, their ambitions stretching across coastlines and across time itself. Their empire was not built on cruelty, but on legendary endurance, and the Nords became known far beyond their borders for their strength, honor, and relentless will. Skyrim grew into a land of heroes, its every stone carrying echoes of victories sung across mead halls and whispered in the winds that sweep across tundra fields. But even in times of unity, challenges rose like mountains appearing from mist. The elves of the Snow Prince's lands, the Falmer who once shone with wisdom and grace, clashed repeatedly with the Nords. Long before their tragic descent into blindness and madness under Dwemer rule, the Snow Elves were a cultured, complex civilization. Their towers gleamed like ice-catching moonlight, and their records described the world with elegance unmatched by human hands. Yet tension grew as both races expanded. Borders pressed against each other until conflict became inevitable. War erupted between human and elf, and though the Snow Elves wielded magic of breathtaking beauty, the Nords fought with a fury fueled by ancestral pride. Their clash culminated in the Battle of Mosring, where the Snow Prince, radiant and revered, fell beneath a volley of human weapons. His defeat marked the end of an era for the Falmer, sending them fleeing underground in desperation. Those depths below the earth held another people entirely, the Dwemer, masters of logic, metal, and mystery. Their underground cities were marvels of invention, powered by mechanisms so advanced they appeared as sorcery to outsiders. When the Falmer sought refuge, the Dwemer agreed, but at a terrible cost. Blinded, broken, and forced into servitude, the Falmer slowly transformed into something unrecognizable, a people stripped of culture and memory. Meanwhile, above ground, the Nords expanded further, shaping Skyrim into a tapestry of clans and holds, each led by Jarls, whose bloodlines carried stories older than stone. Cities like Whiterun, Windhelm, and Markarth became centers of culture and power, their walls and halls built by hands, calloused from labor, but steady with pride. Yet beneath every golden age lies a shadow. As centuries turned, the Dwemer vanished in an instant of impossible magnitude, entire civilizations collapsing in silent unison. Whether through hubris, experimentation, or cosmic error, they stepped out of reality entirely, leaving behind empty halls filled with machines still marching to commands long forgotten. The disappearance of the dwarves rippled across Skyrim, shaping its mysteries for ages to come. The Nords, left to interpret a world without their enigmatic neighbors, wove stories about the Dwemer's fate, some filled with awe, others with fear. The centuries that followed drifted into periods of division and recovery. Skyrim remained a land of rugged independence, its holds governed by families who valued tradition above all else. Their songs spoke of ancestors who crossed frozen seas, who shouted dragons from the sky, who carved kingdoms with axes and dreams. But the deep past never truly stayed buried. Ancient tombs of dragon priests remained untouched, their mummified guardians resting beneath heavy stone lids. Even in death, they clung to their power. The Nord farmers who tilled nearby soil whispered that the ground trembled some nights, as though something beneath had remembered how to move. The old runes carved into rocks near forgotten ruins seemed to glow faintly when moonlight touched them, and travelers claimed to hear distant, guttural chanting carried across lonely mountaintops. Through all of this, the Dragonborn prophecy drifted like smoke through time, passed down from one storyteller to the next. It spoke of a mortal blessed with the soul and voice of a dragon, destined to rise in an age of crisis. Most considered it a tale meant to frighten or entertain, a myth charming enough to tell by firelight. But others, especially the graybeards atop High Hrothgar, tended their silent vigil, waiting for the world to tremble beneath a voice powerful enough to shake their mountain home. And so Skyrim moved into the era that would eventually lead to its greatest trials: civil war, the rise of ancient evils, and the return of beings older than kingdoms. The land weathered storms of politics and prophecy, changing slowly, quietly, just as mountains shift grain by grain beneath endless snow. It became a land defined by scars and stories, a place where ancient truth slept beneath rivers and forests, waiting patiently for the day they would awaken. Every field, every valley, every stone ruin carried the quiet burden of history, whispering fragments of ages long past to those willing to listen. The centuries that followed the fall of the Raymond dynasty brought Tamriel into a long stretch of uncertainty, a time when the empire drifted between competing warlords, crumbling provinces, and ambitious generals who all believed destiny had placed the ruby throne in their path. Out of this slow-moving storm emerged a figure whose name would eventually define an entire era: Tiber Septim, a man who rose from obscurity in the late Second Era and carried the fire of conquest across the land with an almost serene precision. When he reached Skyrim, he found a people divided by ancient rivalries, each hold clinging to its own customs, each jarl guarding their borders like stubborn mountain lions. Yet even in their division, the Nords recognized something familiar in Tiber, something resonant, as though the cold wind itself whispered his name. Some legends claim he carried the blessing of kine, others suggest he had the latent spark of a dragonborn long before the world understood what that meant. Whatever the truth, the Nords joined him willingly, layering their voices upon his call for unity, helping forge the empire that would eventually stretch from the frigid sea of ghosts to the blistering sands of elsewhere. Under the Septim banner, Skyrim settled into a strange quietude, a rare moment in history where the holds breathed together instead of apart. The old holds continued honoring their grim traditions, but even they felt the weight of destiny pulling the world towards something larger. As the empire grew, Skyrim became a pillar of strength within it, its warriors filling the ranks of every legion, its smiths providing steel renowned across continents. Yet despite this cohesion, the ancient rhythms of the land persisted. Dragons remained mythical and distant, spoken of only in sagas and carved into temple walls. The Greybeards watched from High Hrothgar as empires rose and fell like winter storms. The Nords lived their lives by the seasons, hunting in winter, trading in summer, celebrating old heroes in great halls filled with firelight. Even during the early Septim years, the land held a deep, tranquil timelessness, as if Skyrim's mountains barely noticed the nations shifting around them. When Tiber Septim eventually achieved apotheosis, ascending into the divine fabric of the world as Talos, Skyrim embraced him in a way no other province did. To the Nords, his elevation was not only believable, it felt inevitable. They saw in him the echoes of Shor and the strength of Ysgramor, a mortal who stepped boldly into a god's mantle. Temples to Talos arose in every major city, and his clergy maintained a steady presence across the frozen province, teaching that the voice of mankind had finally entered the heavens. Even the Greybeards, though reclusive, acknowledged the seismic shift in the Thu'um's place within mortal destiny. Skyrim entered an era where faith, honor, and imperial unity interlaced like threads of the same tapestry, and for a time, the province thrived under the Pax Cyrodiilica, the peaceful glow of Septim rule. But the world began to shift once more as the Third Era aged. The Septim bloodline, having reigned for generations, grew thinner, and the empire began straining to keep its hold on distant provinces. Skyrim, ever proud and fiercely protective of its traditions, remained loyal yet watchful. The holds continued their local feuds, old grudges simmering quietly beneath civil courtesy. Whiterun maintained its neutral stance, the Reach bristled under external influence, and the Stormcloak line and Windhelm kept the old blood of Ysgramor alive in their halls. Yet for all this, it was not internal politics that threatened the world during this period. It was the thinning barriers between Tamriel and the plains beyond it. The Oblivion Crisis arrived like a sudden tear in the world's breath, a moment when the sky opened and the Daedra marched into mortal lands with fire, claws, and unnatural hunger. Across Tamriel, cities burned, forests withered, and people whispered prayers into the void, hoping the divine still listened. Skyrim, with its proud warriors and hardy spirit, weathered the crisis with a mix of ferocity and ancestral resilience. Daedric gates appeared across the holds, spewing forth horrors from Mehrunes Dagon's realm, yet the Nords fought them with a determination carved from millennia of surviving winter, famine, and war. Some gates were destroyed by local heroes, others collapsed under the weight of the Dragonfire's final extinguishing, but all of them left scars across the snow that would never truly fade. When Martin Septim sacrificed himself to seal the rift between worlds, ending the crisis and the Septim dynasty in a single, fiery moment, Skyrim entered a period of introspection. With no dragonfires to protect the realm, the world felt subtly thinner, the weave between planes looser and more vulnerable. Priests of Talos began whispering of omens hidden in the wind, of shouts heard faintly atop the throat of the world without a source, as though the very mountain mourned the loss of the dragon blood that once tethered the mundane and the divine. The Nords continued their lives, but underneath daily routine, something deeper stirred, a quiet sense that an old song was beginning to echo again. In the years following the Oblivion Crisis, the empire fractured like ice under a shifting river. Provinces sought independence, trade routes grew unstable, and Cyrodiil struggled to maintain its authority. Skyrim, though tied to the empire by centuries of faith and law, felt the tension rising. Some Jarls argued for secession, believing the province strong enough to stand alone as it had in ages past, while others insisted loyalty to the empire was the only path to stability. The Stormcloak lineage, rooted in Windhelm's frost-covered throne room, grew increasingly vocal about Skyrim's right to self-govern. In contrast, the more cosmopolitan holds, particularly, Solitude leaned toward imperial unity, citing history, diplomacy, and mutual defense as reasons to remain aligned. But long before these arguments erupted into open conflict, an unseen shift began deep within the earth and sky. Ancient ruins trembled faintly, not from earthquakes, but from faint vibrations echoing through dragon-forged stone. Barrow seals that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years creaked under pressure, and some whispered that the dead Draugr stirred more restlessly in their tombs. Old scholars in Winterhold noticed that certain constellations seemed brighter during specific months, as though the heavens were aligning in preparation for something. The Greybeards, silent atop their mountain, felt the faintest shiver run through the fabric of the voice. Though they did not speak of it openly, their meditations deepened, their chants lengthened, and the winds around High Hrothgar carried hints of primordial unrest. Meanwhile, the political landscape shifted dramatically when the Thalmor rose to power in the Somerset Isles, reshaping the Aldmeri Dominion with an iron will and ancient authority. Their ideology spread with chilling confidence, declaring men inferior and Talos worship heretical. When the Great War erupted between the Empire and the Dominion, Skyrim sent many of its bravest warriors to fight in bloody, desperate battles that stretched from the heart of Cyrodiil to the forested borders of Valenwood. The Nords fought fiercely, believing the Empire's unity essential against such a formidable foe. Yet despite their valor, the war ended with the White Gold Concordat, a treaty that forbid the worship of Talos and carved humiliation into the Empire's wounded pride. Skyrim recoiled at the ban, for Talos was not merely a god to the Nords, he was kin, a hero whose footsteps echoed up their mountains and through their hearts. The ban struck at the core of their identity, unraveling old trust between Skyrim and the Empire. Some Jarls obeyed reluctantly, others resisted quietly, but in Windhelm, opposition burned like a forge. Ulfric Stormcloak, Jarl of the ancient city, emerged as the loudest voice of rebellion, refusing to abandon the worship of the man-god, whose spirit he believed still guided Skyrim's destiny. His war cry split the province in two, pulling families, cities, and alliances into the slow spiral of civil war that simmered for years. Even as this conflict brewed, darker forces stirred beneath the world's surface. Dragon burial mounds shifted in their sleep, ancient wards weakened by time and cosmic imbalance. Scholars studying old texts noticed peculiar syncs between celestial events and tremors felt near forgotten temples. The songs of the bards remained unchanged, but the wind carried undertones reminiscent of dragon cries, the same primal resonance recorded in the oldest Nordic legends. Skyrim's people, though weary from war and political unrest, sensed something strange returning, something older than empires and deeper than prophecy. By the time the Fourth Era settled into its rhythm, Skyrim had become a province caught between past and future. The Empire weakened but endured. The Dominion hovered like a shadow beyond the mountains. The Civil War smoldered across the holds, each skirmish reinforcing old divisions. Yet beneath all of this, the land itself felt alive in a way it hadn't for centuries, as though ancient forces that once shaped creation had started whispering again. The mountains seemed sharper, the sky clearer, the ruins more restless. Barrows that once slumbered undisturbed echoed faintly with the shifting of Draugr awakening to distant calls. The magical currents of the world tightened, curling inward like breath drawn before speech. This was the era when fate itself grew heavy, when the timeline of the world bent toward a single, inevitable point. The return of the dragons was drawing near, although not yet visible to the common traveler. The Greybeards felt it most strongly, their meditations quivering with premonition as though Kine's winds carried warnings from the dawn of time. Skyrim, a land forged in myth, stood unknowingly on the edge of its greatest story, one that would reawaken ancient shouts, resurrect vanished legends, and pull the dragon blood back into the world with a force that echoed across every realm, every mountain, and every soul that walked beneath the northern sky. As the Third Era drew quietly toward its ending, there was a feeling across Tamriel, one that settled like distant thunder, hinting that the world was entering the final breaths of a cycle older than memory. Skyrim's people lived their lives unaware of the trembling foundations beneath them, the shifting patterns of prophecy beginning to stir across the heavens. But the throat of the world felt it first, for mountains remember ages the way humans remember dreams, and the bones of that ancient peak shivered with an awareness of change. The Greybeards grew silent even in their normal silence, meditating longer, breathing deeper, as if preparing for an echo that had not sounded in centuries. High Hrothgar became a place heavy with stillness, the kind that follows a question asked by the gods but not yet answered. Far to the south, the Septim Empire strained to hold itself together. Cyrodiil, once the confident heart of the known world, began to show cracks in its ancient unity. The heirs of Tiber Septim struggled not only against political unrest, but against the slow erosion of divine authority. The dragonfires, long kept burning by sacred covenant, flickered dangerously low, signaling that the packed sealing mundus from oblivion grew fragile. In Skyrim, this danger was felt like a shift in the wind. Priests spoke less boldly of the Nine, and traveling merchants whispered about omens on the roads. Wolves howling in midday, stones falling from clear skies, lights flickering over barrows once believed dormant. Skyrim's landscape often acted as an early warning, responding to metaphysical imbalances with eerie natural signs. Meanwhile, the Nords continued their daily lives with the resilience that had shaped them for eras. Small feuds between clans sparked and died. Jarls pressed their agendas with familiar stubbornness, and the holds maintained their independent identities. Whiterun prospered from its central position and its role as the region's trade crossroads. Windhelm clung to its older traditions, its stone walls echoing the voices of ancestors who built the first human kingdom. Markarth remained uneasy, still entangled in the iron grip of Dwemer architecture and the lingering tension with the Reachmen. Solitude, as always, perched with noble dignity over the sea, carrying the faint arrogance of a city whose rulers believed themselves the rightful stewards of the North. Yet beneath all this normalcy, cracks formed in ways too subtle for ordinary citizens to notice. When Emperor Uriel Septim VII ascended to leadership, Skyrim entered a period of cautious calm. The Empire's long reach ensured trade routes stayed open, and foreign armies kept their distance, giving the hold space to manage their internal affairs. But invisible threats began to weave themselves into the world's fabric. Assassins sharpened their daggers in shadowy corners, Daedric cults moved behind locked doors, and ancient prophecies whispered through dreams carried on cold mountain winds. Skyrim's seers spoke of dragons long thought extinct as symbols rather than beasts, metaphors for cycles ending and beginning, though some believed the metaphor could one day become literal. Most dismissed these predictions as mere superstition, but the Greybeards felt the tremor of truth within them. During these later years of the Third Era, the borders between Oblivion and Nirn grew dangerously thin. Unexplained magical anomalies surged in remote areas of Skyrim. Midnight auroras flickered in strange colors, some described as unnatural violet or burning orange, painting skies with patterns not seen in living memory. Mages at the College of Winterhold recorded sudden distortions in the flow of magicka, brief pulses like heartbeats of a world that had grown tired. Alchemists noticed rare ingredients behaving oddly. Frost salts evaporated faster, and nirnroot hummed more intensely near cold water. To scholars, these were signs of instability. To common folk, they were omens, and to the priests, they were warnings whispered by the divines. The Empire grew desperate to maintain control. Its armies patrolled Skyrim's borders more aggressively, worried about cult uprisings or foreign powers exploiting the weakening state of the dragonfires. In small villages tucked between mountains, strange figures cloaked in red robes were occasionally spotted performing nighttime rituals near Nordic ruins, speaking in tongues that had not been heard since the early First Era. These events were too scattered to cause widespread alarm, but the pattern formed a quiet tension beneath Skyrim's daily life. Something was gathering. Something was waiting for the perfect moment to break the fragile silence between eras. Yet the people of Skyrim remained rooted in their customs, and life continued with familiar predictability. Smiths forged iron blades beside hot forges, unaware that they stood at the edge of an age soon to be reshaped by forces older than their ancestors. Farmers tended snowy fields, their breath freezing in white clouds against the dawn, oblivious to the cosmic negotiations unfolding above them. In the markets of solitude, merchants argued over prices with the same stubborn persistence shown for centuries, unaware that their routines were part of a world soon to change forever. Skyrim existed in this balance of the ordinary and the extraordinary, a place where mundane life rested quietly on the shoulders of myth. But prophecy cannot be kept at bay forever. When the assassination of the Emperor shattered the illusion of stability, the shock echoed all the way into Skyrim's mountain valleys. People spoke in frightened tones about the fall of the Septums, about the death of a bloodline that had ruled for 400 years. And though Skyrim was far from Cyrodiil's political heart, its people could feel the disturbance ripple north, carried by ravens and rumors. For the Nords, who valued the strength of leaders above all else, such fragmentation of the empire felt like a breach in the very order of things. The divines themselves seemed to have stepped back, letting chaos slip through cracks that had long been sealed. The Oblivion Crisis erupted soon afterward, tearing open the seams between dimensions. In Cyrodiil, gates opened like fiery wounds, but Skyrim saw fewer breaches. Those that did appear were swiftly closed by warriors who treated them not as apocalyptic threats, but as challenges to be conquered. Yet even these small incursions left scars on the land. Burned patches of earth near lakes and forests remained blackened long after the crisis ended. Animals avoided those spaces as if they sensed lingering echoes of Daedric presence. Some caves filled with frost even in summer, affected by residual magic that refused to die. The world felt shifted, altered, touched by forces from outside reality's normal bounds. When Martin Septim sacrificed himself to close the gates and end the crisis, the dragonfires went out forever. The Empire entered the Fourth Era without the divine pact that had protected Mundus for millennia. This meant that anything was now possible, both in ruin and in rebirth. Skyrim responded to this transition with stoic resilience. The Holds returned to a mindset more rooted in self-governance. Jarls reclaimed stronger authority within their territories, judging disputes, maintaining laws, and defending their lands with hardened pride. The absence of a strong empire gave them space to assert their traditions more boldly, but it also invited new tensions between factions and families, setting the stage for a future conflict that would eventually ignite civil war. During the early Fourth Era, Skyrim entered a period of slow, uneasy rebuilding. Trade resumed, cities remained intact, and life settled into a new rhythm. But the political landscape had shifted like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Solitude aligned firmly with the Empire, believing unity essential for survival. Windhelm leaned toward independence, its people remembering the ancient strength of a free Skyrim. These new ideological divides brewed quietly beneath the surface, unspoken but deeply felt, especially among warriors and leaders who saw the world in terms of honor, heritage, and rightful rule. Though no battles erupted yet, the tension grew like pressure under stone. In the far north, Winterhold's mages noticed peculiar fluctuations in the flow of magicka that seemed tied to the fading of the septum line. Spells misfired more often, wards flickered unexpectedly, and even conjuration rituals occasionally produced strange, unintended results. These oddities hinted at deeper disturbances in the metaphysical balance between Oblivion and Mundus. Some scholars whispered that the loss of the dragonfires destabilized the boundary entirely, creating small fractures through which changes seeped into the world like unseen currents. Winterhold's college became increasingly concerned, though its warnings fell on indifferent ears. Most Nords distrusted magic too deeply to care about mysteries outside their practical lives. Still, the land remembered. Ancient ruins stirred faintly, as if the souls sleeping within began to turn in their stone beds. The wind around Dragon Mounds blew colder, sharper, carrying tones that didn't sound like natural breezes. Wildlife acted strangely near old Nordic temples, avoiding paths they once traveled without hesitation. Even the sky above the throat of the world glowed differently at dusk, streaked with a pale silver shimmer that lasted a moment too long to be coincidence. The world felt like a book whose final chapter had been written but never read, waiting for someone to open it once more. And though no one in Skyrim knew it yet, all these signs, political, spiritual, and natural, were merely the faintest prelude to the awakening of a prophecy so ancient that even time itself seemed to pause in anticipation. The World Eater stirred in distant realms, not yet visible but present like the first breath before a storm, and Skyrim, rugged and unyielding, stood quietly at the center of the coming age. Even as Alduin vanished from the world, torn from the sky by a power older than any kingdom of men, the land of Skyrim did not immediately soften. The air still trembled with the echoes of ancient shouts, and the mountains still held the chill of battles fought on their peaks. The Dragonborn's final confrontation did not end an era overnight. Instead, it created a strange, gentle silence across the province, the kind that follows a great storm when the winds finally rest and the world begins to settle into itself again. Whiterun's fields grew quiet as farmers returned to their plows, half expecting the skies to split open again. In the wilds, animals slowly stepped back into territories they had abandoned during the chaos. Cities repaired their walls, swept burnt stone from their streets, and tried to understand what it meant to exist in a world where dragons had taken to the wind once more, but without their once terrifying leader to bind them together. The sky felt wider, the air clearer, and yet the mountains held their breath, as if expecting history to change again at any moment. The Greybeards returned to their silence, withdrawing even deeper into the halls of High Hrothgar, their voices once again locked away behind meditative calm. They watched the sky from their stone terraces, listening not for threats, but for the first true peace they had known since Alduin's return. Even Paarthurnax, perched atop the throat of the world, remained thoughtful and still, the wind curling softly around his ancient wings. For him, the end of Alduin was not triumph or tragedy, but a turning of pages in a book he had been reading for ages. He became the silent watcher of Skyrim's future, observing the faint shifts in mortal hearts, the subtle changes in their ambitions, and the lingering resonance the Dragonborn's presence left woven through the land. The mountain grew warm beneath him, not with fire but with the soft glow of prophecy fulfilled, and yet he knew that destiny did not end with Alduin. The world moved forward, and dragons, even if fewer in number, still carried ancient wisdom in their wings, waiting for new eras to define themselves. Across Skyrim, the remnants of the Civil War lay like scattered ashes of a long-burning fire. Forts once claimed by Imperials or Stormcloaks now echoed with emptiness, their banners torn by wind rather than torn by battle. Certain roads still held the faint marks of marching armies, footprints left in hardened mud, and wheel tracks leading toward cities that no longer feared siege. In some regions, soldiers who once fought fiercely against their own kinsmen found themselves sharing ale at campfires or working side by side to rebuild bridges, repair watchtowers, or clear out the bandits who had taken advantage of wartime chaos. The province entered a strange state of unity, born not from treaties, but from exhaustion, a tired harmony that settles into a nation only when it has spent too long wrapped in fear. Skyrim was wounded, but the wounds began to close slowly, tenderly, each day adding another thin layer of healing. Meanwhile, the College of Winterhold resumed its quiet pursuit of knowledge. After the turmoil of the Eye of Magnus and the ruin nearly brought upon them by ancient forces they barely understood, the mages of Skyrim grew more cautious, their research gentler, slower, more respectful of the powers they touched. The Archmage's quarters glowed with candlelight late into the night, filled with parchment, scribbled with theories about the nature of magic, the flow of energies through ley lines, and the fragile balance between mortal understanding and the vast arcane currents that shaped the world. Apprentices trained with softer voices and steadier hands, learning not just spells, but the humility required to wield them. The college, once feared by the people of Skyrim, began to open its gates a little wider, allowing travelers and scholars to share in its quiet work, hoping to mend the distrust that had lingered since the ancient collapse of Winterhold. Throughout the holds, new leaders emerged from the ashes of old conflicts. Some Jarls sought stability above all else, forging alliances with guilds, clans, and wandering heroes to strengthen their borders. Others turned inward, focusing on rebuilding city streets, protecting trade routes, and ensuring that their people could sleep without hearing dragons in the distance or wondering whether another war might ignite. The people of Skyrim, hardened by centuries of frost and conflict, carried on with a kind of hopeful resilience, planting seeds in frozen soil, tending to hearths and stone houses, and teaching children stories of dragons not as monsters, but as reminders that the world is full of wonders, capable of returning at any moment. Life did not return to normal. Skyrim had never known a normal age, but it found a new rhythm, one that matched the breath of a province learning to live again. The guilds, scattered across the land, each found their own subtle transformations in the wake of these changes. The Thieves' Guild, once a shadow of its former self, rediscovered its influence beneath the bridges and alleys of Riften, its members whispering of new golden ages, just as they whispered through hidden tunnels and moonlit rooftops. They stole not out of desperation, but out of tradition, continuing a lineage that stretched back further than most cared to know. The Dark Brotherhood, frail and fractured, attempted to rebuild itself from the shadows, their sanctuary lit by the flicker of candles that symbolized rebirth as much as they symbolized death. Their whispers grew softer, their movements quieter, embodying a world where violence of purpose still existed, but with fewer hands to carry it out. The Companions continued their legacy atop Jorrvaskr, guiding new warriors not just in combat, but in what honor and loyalty meant when the world no longer shook from ancient dragons or mortal wars. Even the Reach, rugged and scarred by centuries of conflict between Nords and the native Reach folk, felt small shifts in the years after Alduin's fall. Old tensions did not vanish, but they softened around the edges as clans and cities alike focused more on survival and less on conquest. The land itself responded, forests grew denser, rivers ran clearer, and the deep caverns beneath the mountains echoed with fewer cries of civil strife. The Forsworn remained fierce in their reclamation efforts, yet even they felt the thaw of change, their druids studying omens in smoke and stone to determine whether the age of iron and blood was slowly giving way to a gentler future. Across the hills, briar hearts beat like soft drums beneath the earth, guardians of traditions older than the white towers of Solitude or the market stalls of Whiterun. Along the sea of ghosts, the wind carried fewer cries of war and more quiet songs of longboats gliding through icy waters, their passengers returning to trade rather than raid. Fishermen who once feared dragons swooping from the clouds now feared only winter storms rolling in from the north. The ocean remained as dangerous as ever, but its dangers felt familiar, something that Skyrim had known since the dawn of the First Era. Along the coast, ruins of ancient Nordic settlements continued to crumble beneath frost, each stone whispering stories of explorers and warriors who sailed across the world long before empires rose or dragonborn voices shook the sky. The sea held its memories tightly, keeping them safe beneath waves that felt as old as time itself. In the southern marshes of Hjalmarch, mist curled around the ruins of Labyrinthian, still resonant with ancient magics that lingered long after the Dragonborn passed through its halls. Ghostly breezes rustled through broken pillars, and the faint echo of spells from centuries past drifted like invisible currents. Scholars avoided the ruins, out of respect as much as fear, understanding that some places are best left to sleep. The dragons who remained in Skyrim often flew above Labyrinthian at dawn, their shadows stretching over the cold stone as if greeting the old magic that once shaped their kind. Places like this held a silence deeper than any words, the silence of histories buried beneath frost and stone. The tombs of the dragon priests, many of which had stirred during Alduin's return, gradually fell dormant again. Their guardians, restless during the height of the crisis, returned to their eternal slumber, their masks resting atop sarcophagi sealed by time and ancient enchantments. The temples, heavy with dust and the faint glow of forgotten wards, grew still, becoming once more the quiet guardians of a past age wrapped in myth and legend. The few dragons who remained sometimes perched atop these ancient places, as if honoring memories older than Skyrim itself. The land began to breathe again, slowly, as echoes of dragonfire faded into legend once more. The Dwemer ruins, always silent and eerie, seemed to hum faintly in the new calm that followed Skyrim's tumultuous years. Travelers passing through Blackreach reported that the great glowing mushrooms pulsed more softly, their light rising and falling like the breath of a sleeping giant. Some theorized that the tonal energies that once resonated through the Dwemer's subterranean halls reacted to the shifting balance of the surface world, though no one could explain how. The mechanical constructs still patrolled with unwavering precision, unaffected by wars, dragons, or the comings and goings of adventurers. Skyrim's deeper mysteries did not fade. They simply rested, waiting for curious minds brave enough to disturb their slumber. As seasons turned and years passed, the stories of Alduin's defeat grew softer around their edges, shifting from first-hand accounts to tales told by hearthlight in longhouses and taverns. Bards sang of the Dragonborn with voices full of reverence, turning battles into legends and legends into myths. Children grew up hearing these songs, imagining dragons soaring above the mountains in skies painted gold by sunrise. In time, even those who witnessed the return of dragons began to question the details, memory fading like fog rolling back from the sea. Skyrim moved into an age where the extraordinary slowly settled into the realm of story, a place where history and myth braided together so seamlessly that no one could say where one ended and the other began. In the end, the years after Alduin became a chapter of quiet transformation for Skyrim, an age defined less by conflict and more by reflection. The province, shaped by frost and stone and ancient destiny, carried its scars with dignity, allowing them to become part of its beauty rather than its burden. Skyrim did not become peaceful. It was never meant to be a land free of struggle, but it became something steadier, something calmer, something capable of carrying its history forward without trembling beneath its weight. The world did not forget its past. It simply learned how to live with it. And beneath the snow-covered peaks and within the deep forests where the wind whispered through ancient pines, Skyrim waited patiently for the next age to unfold, as it always had, as it always would. The years that followed the rise of the early Jarls brought a long stretch of uneasy peace across Skyrim, the kind of calm that settles only after enough generations forget what it means to live under constant invasion. With the dragon cult shattered, the elves withdrawn from Nordic lands, and the last echoes of the Atmaran migrations fading into myth, the people of Skyrim slowly began shaping the world into something recognizable, something less like a battlefield and more like a home. It was during this quiet middle era that Skyrim's cities began to take on their lasting shapes, their identities forged not by conquest, but by weather, geography, and the personalities of the clans who settled there. Markarth grew from Dwemer ruins repurposed by Reachfolk and later claimed by Nords, seeking stone strongholds that could defy time. Whiterun blossomed into a trading center built on open plains, where horses ran free and caravans passed without obstruction, a place touched more by wind than war. Windhelm remained rigid and proud, clinging to memories of Ysgramor like a grand hall holding its breath. These shifting identities were not simply cultural but emotional, each hold carrying a different reflection of the Nordic spirit, like facets of a single fractured memory. Across this same era, religion in Skyrim evolved from reverence of ancestors to worship of the divines, blending Atmaran beliefs with the doctrines carried by travelers from Cyrodiil. Kyne never lost her place as the beating heart of the Nordic pantheon, still seen as the breath of the sky and the guiding hand of every warrior who dared to climb a mountain alone. But Akatosh's influence grew steadily, not by force but by the quiet spread of imperial teachings, slowly weaving dragon imagery into the fabric of Nordic faith. Shrines to Talos appeared much later, becoming symbols of defiance, unity, and the unbroken line between man and God. The land absorbed each new faith like snowfall sinking into soil, reshaping itself without ever surrendering its oldest truths. In this way, Skyrim's spiritual identity became something layered and intricate, half mountain, half sky, half memory, half rebellion. It reflected the land's personality, stubborn yet flexible, fierce yet yearning for something eternal. As centuries passed, the balance between humans and nature shifted yet again. The forests of the Rift thickened with ancient trees whose roots coiled around ruins older than memory. Bears and wolves claimed the high passes, shaping the rhythm of everyday life for farmers who learned to respect the wild rather than tame it. In the marshes of Hallmarch, fog rolled in like a living creature, swallowing roads and landmarks until only the bravest dared travel without a torch lit high above their heads. The Sea of Ghosts churned endlessly along the northern coast, reshaping the shoreline with each passing storm. These natural forces were not obstacles but teachers, reminders that Skyrim belonged first to the land and only second to the people. To live there was to yield to its storms, to adapt to its cold, and to learn that sometimes survival itself was an act of devotion. This middle era became a time of settlement, of learning to coexist with the world rather than conquering it. But even this quiet stability was punctured by shadows from deep below. The return of mining operations in Skyrim brought with it discoveries of buried relics, shattered Dwemer constructs, and cavern networks that pulsed with strange energies. The Nords believed these were remnants of the Deep Elves' hubris, but scholars insisted they were signs of something far more complex machinery that had never fully shut down, humming faintly with the last breath of a vanished race. Some miners claimed they heard faint metallic whispers echoing through abandoned Dwemer halls, as though the ghosts of vanished engineers still lingered, observing silently from unseen corners. Others spoke of strange lights that drifted through underground chambers like dreams trying to escape stone. These lingering mysteries gave Skyrim an undercurrent of unease, a reminder that not all history rests quietly beneath the ground. The Dwemer may have disappeared, but their legacy remained embedded in the world like a wound that refused to close. During this same period, the Reach grew fiercely independent, shaped by clans who thrived in the jagged cliffs and winding valleys. Their culture blended ancient animism with hard-won survival, creating a people defined by resilience, pride, and a fierce dedication to their land. The Nords always viewed the Reach folk with suspicion, seeing their ways as foreign and their rituals as threats. This tension simmered for generations, a fire that flickered quietly between cycles of uneasy peace and sudden violence. The Reach became a contested frontier not because it lacked structure, but because it carried too much history, too many claims, too many memories, too many stories carved into stone. Even in quiet centuries, the region felt like a place waiting for the next spark to ignite the old struggle once more. Meanwhile, the College of Winterhold rose slowly into prominence, attracting scholars, mages, and seekers of hidden knowledge from across Tamriel. For the first time in Skyrim's history, magic found a permanent home, not in scattered hearth witches or wandering shamans, but in a towering citadel built to tame the arcane. Its creation marked a turning point in Skyrim's relationship with magic, transforming it from a feared wild art into something structured, studied, and cautiously respected. Yet even as the college grew, Winterhold itself began to wane, battered by storms, isolation, and the shifting currents of trade that pulled wealth toward cities farther south. Magic thrived, but the city that housed it slowly slipped into decline, a reflection of Skyrim's complicated relationship with forces beyond mortal understanding. It was a place caught between the past and the future, its glory and its ruin intertwined like snow caught in the wind. The rise of the Jarls during this era brought further transformation. Each hold developed its own governance, traditions, and systems of justice, shaped by the personalities of their leaders and the landscapes they ruled. Some Jarls became legends for their wisdom, others for their folly, but all contributed to the delicate balance that allowed Skyrim to function as a collection of fiercely independent territories held together by culture rather than law. This decentralized system gave Skyrim both strength and fragility, unity when threatened, conflict when left alone. It became a land defined by the interplay between freedom and order, where loyalty to one's hold mattered as much as loyalty to the province itself. This era set the stage for centuries of political tension that would later culminate in civil war. Yet beneath the surface, it also nurtured the rugged independence that became the heartbeat of Skyrim's people. And through it all, Dragons remain nothing more than legends whispered around longhouse fires. Their memory lingered in carvings, runes, and ancient texts, but no one living had seen wings darken the sky. The dragon cult's defeat faded into myth, its temples reclaimed by time and snow. Children grew up hearing stories of fire-breathing beasts and ancient priests who once ruled the world, but these tales felt distant, impossible, almost comforting in their impossibility. Skyrim entered an age where the past felt safely buried, a time when the greatest dangers came from men and nature rather than the ancient beings who once shaped the world's destiny. It was an era of ignorance, blessed by peace, a long, gentle breath in the timeline of a land that rarely knew rest. Yet even in this quiet age, signs of the old world stirred beneath the surface. Word walls remained intact, their runes whispering faintly in voices too old to comprehend. Dragons' burial mounds lay dormant like sleeping giants, their secrets preserved beneath layers of frost and time. Ancient prophecies drifted through the oral traditions of priests who barely believed them anymore, prophecies speaking of a coming doom and a single soul born with the power to stop it. All these remnants waited patiently, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across centuries. Skyrim's peace was beautiful, but it was temporary, a lull before history reclaimed its momentum. For now, though, this middle era of Skyrim's timeline remained a tapestry of slow growth, quiet reflection, and gentle cultural evolution. It was the calm before the storm, the memory before the awakening, the final breath before the dragons of old stirred once again. In this stretch of centuries, Skyrim became not just a battlefield or a legendary homeland, it became a world, shaped softly by time, carrying the weight of ancient stories without yet realizing how soon they would return. As Skyrim moved deeper into the Fourth Era, the province seemed to exist in a space between fading memory and rising tension, a land caught halfway between the weight of its ancient past and the uncertainty of the world it was slowly becoming. The Empire, though diminished, still clung to its identity with careful, deliberate breath, while the Thalmor worked tirelessly to shape history in ways that made them appear not just victorious but inevitable. Skyrim was no longer the beating heart of a great empire, nor a forgotten northern frontier. It was the place where the future of Tamriel quietly balanced on the edge of every wandering breeze. Its people sensed this in ways they couldn't fully explain. Farmers in the Pale whispered that the snows fell differently, as if the sky were listening more carefully. Merchants in Riften noticed that rumors traveled faster than coin, carried first by anxious glances before spreading through words. Even the children playing in Windhelm's narrow alleys sensed something simmering beneath the surface, some quiet expectation that the world was holding its breath. The tension that had brewed since the signing of the White Gold Concordat reached deeper into Skyrim than most realized. The banning of Talos worship became more than a political decree. It was a wound carved into the soul of a people whose identity was built on the belief that a mortal had once risen among the gods. Temples closed their doors reluctantly, some priests obeying out of fear and others refusing silently, continuing their prayers behind shuttered windows and dim candles. And while the Thalmor patrolled with watchful eyes, their presence in the province didn't feel like authority so much as a shadow stretching further than it should, as though their influence came not from numbers, but from something heavier, something woven into fear itself. The Nords who lived through those years often described it as the sound of distant thunder that never quite reached the mountains, always rumbling at the horizon without ever breaking into storm. It was enough to unsettle even the most steadfast hearts. As the Empire struggled to maintain order, the question of Skyrim's loyalty became an ember smoldering in the wind. The people remembered the days when the Empire had been strong, when the unity of Cyrodiil and its provinces had felt like a great shield spanning all of Tamriel. But those memories felt distant now, softened with age like old songs recalled more for their rhythm than their meaning. The events of the Great War left scars deeper than broken buildings or burned villages. They left doubts carved into the trust between rulers and ruled. Many Nords wondered whether the Empire's sacrifices had protected them or simply postponed the inevitable. Others insisted that unity was their only refuge in a continent rising toward conflict once more. The years leading to the Civil War unfolded quietly at first, as they always do when history prepares to break itself open. Individuals living simple lives found themselves drawn into conversations they never expected to have. Farmers debating the value of rebellion, blacksmiths questioning the nature of loyalty, old warriors wondering whether their strength was meant for peace or for war. The unrest didn't sweep across the land in one dramatic wave. It seeped slowly into the cracks of everyday life. A traveler might notice a village suddenly divided over a shrine left standing beside a road, or a family refusing to speak openly at their own table after hearing a knock on the door too late at night. Skyrim's cold winds carried more than snow, they carried distrust, sharpened like the edge of an unseen blade. Even as these new troubles rose, the ancient forces of Skyrim remained ever present, watching with the patience of stone. The Greybeards continued their silent meditation at High Hrothgar, listening to the eternal echoes of the voice tremble through the mountain's bones. They felt the changes in the world long before anyone else, sensing shifts in the flow of time and destiny like ripples across the surface of a still lake. Few knew the extent of their awareness, but those who did believed the Greybeards could hear history rearranging itself, faint whispers of futures not yet shaped drifting through their meditative visions. Their isolation was not ignorance, but reverence, a vow to remain separate so they could recognize the tremors in the world below. Meanwhile, the ancient barrows and tombs scattered across the province seemed to grow restless. Adventurers reported hearing faint chants in tunnels they believed empty, and crypt guardians awoke more frequently, their eyes glowing with unnatural awareness. Some scholars speculated that the long slumber of the dragon cult's remnants was weakening for reasons no one understood. There were accounts of crypt doors sliding open on nights without wind, of draugr standing in unusual formations as though awaiting some forgotten command. Though most dismissed these tales as wild exaggerations, a few wise mages whispered that the world was preparing itself, aligning quietly for something old enough for even spirits to remember with dread. Beyond the walls of cities and the comfort of hearth fires, nature itself seemed to shift subtly. Storms arrived with sharper winds, as if carrying distant roars from beyond the borders of the world. Auroras pulsed more brightly, shimmering with colors rarely seen before. Travelers spoke of animals behaving strangely in the forests, moving in patterns that felt too deliberate, too synchronized, as though guided by instinct older than mortal life. Even the sky carried hints of unease, with constellations appearing slightly earlier in the season than they should, twinkling with an intensity that made the night feel both beautiful and uneasy. Some scholars argued that these were merely natural fluctuations, but others recognized the signs as remnants of ancient cosmic forces stirring from long dormancy. The province's holds each reacted differently to the shifts of the era. Solitude clung tightly to the empire, not out of blind loyalty, but from a deep belief in stability, fearing that the alternative would plunge Tamriel into chaos it couldn't survive. Markarth turned inward, its people hardened by the Reach's unforgiving landscape, focused more on survival than distant politics. Riften's shadows lengthened with whispered deals and quiet secrets, its underbelly thriving in times when uncertainty made information more valuable than gold. Whiterun walked its careful middle path, hesitating between tradition and diplomacy, knowing that its choice could tip the balance of the province. And Windhelm, with its ancient walls and older pride, simmered with a belief that Skyrim must stand alone or not stand at all. As the tensions of the age matured into sharper conflict, it became clear to many that Skyrim was no longer merely a province, but a crossroads of fate. The echoes of old ages pressed against the present, urging the people toward paths they didn't fully understand. And somewhere deep in the weave of time itself, destiny began drawing its threads together, preparing for the moment when ancient prophecies would reawaken, when forgotten forces would return to reshape the world in ways that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Skyrim, in these years, lived in a state of quiet anticipation, a land sensing something vast approaching from beyond mortal sight. Its mountains whispered in winds older than memory. Its forests carried faint tremors of life shifting beneath the soil, and its people dreamed of symbols they didn't recognize, dreams of wings and fire, of voices carved into stone, of breath that shook eternity itself. And though no one yet understood what those dreams meant, the land had already begun to prepare, opening old wounds and stirring long, slumbering legends, readying itself for the dawn of a new age that would rise from the ashes of the old.